Sometimes life gives us exactly what we don't ask for, but what we need most. Billy Thompson stopped on the porch of his house and watched the wagon approaching from the dusty road. The afternoon sun painted everything golden, but his mind was far from that beauty. I had written to Sarah Mitchell 3 months ago, a Boston woman looking for a fresh start in the West. The letters were few, but enough to let him know that she was a widow, childless, and willing to build a life alongside a hard-working farmer like himself. The wagon stopped in front of the gate, and Billy walked down the creaking wooden steps under his worn-out boots. The driver waved and began to unload the luggage. Then she went downstairs. It wasn't Sarah. The woman who stepped onto the barren Texas ground had her brown hair tied up in a simple bun, her navy blue dress stained by the dust of the trip. Her eyes, when they met his, carried a mixture of tiredness and determination that Billy knew well. It was the look of someone who had lost a lot, but still struggled. She approached with firm steps, despite the hesitation Billy noticed on her face. Behind her, 2 boys got out of the wagon. One must have been about 8 years old, the other maybe 6. They both hid behind their mother's skirts, watching Billy with that cautious curiosity of children who had learned early to be suspicious of strangers. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Mitchell, Sarah's sister. The words came out with difficulty, loaded with a recent pain. Sarah had died 6 weeks ago, victim of pneumonia. Margaret had read the letters Billy had sent to his sister. Letters that spoke of plans and hopes for a new life in the West. Billy felt the ground move beneath his feet. His hands, accustomed to the reins and the handle of the axe, suddenly did not know where to stand. He took off his hat, running his fingers through his dark hair, already marked by some grey strands. The silence stretched between them, like the vastness of the desert. Billy looked at the boys, who were now watching him openly. The eldest had his mother's eyes, but the youngest possessed something different, a sadness that should not exist in someone so young. Margaret explained her situation with the dignity of someone who had long since lost her pride. I had nowhere to go. The landlord of Boston had evicted them when the money ran out. Sarah had always said that Texas was a place where people could start over. The boys were her sons, Thomas and Samuel, fatherless since last winter, when an accident in the harbor took her husband. Billy put his hat back on his head, buying time to think. He had planned a life with Sarah, a woman with no baggage from the past, no complications. And now he stood before Margaret, carrying not only his own grief, but also the responsibility of 2 orphaned children. The wind blew, kicking up dust around them. On the horizon, a hawk circled in search of prey. Billy knew that feeling, that of being watched by fate, waiting to see what choice he would make. He knelt down to be at the height of the boys. Thomas, the eldest, looked at him suspiciously, but Samuel hid his face in his mother's skirt. They were just frightened children in a world that had taken away everything they knew. Billy asked if they liked horses, and even through his shyness, he could see the sparkle of interest in their eyes. The decision came like so many others in her life, not through long thoughts, but from a heart impulse that knew how to recognize what was right. The house was too big for a man alone, and he always needed help with the animals. Billy informed them that they could stay. Margaret didn't smile, it was still too early for that, but something on her shoulders relaxed, like the first ray of sunshine after a storm. She assured that she worked hard and that the boys would not give trouble. Billy nodded, knowing that children who have gone through what they have been through learn to be strong too soon. He grabbed 2 of the heaviest suitcases, nodding his head in the direction of the house. He showed them where they would be and explained that the next day they would talk about how they would make it work. As they walked toward the house, Billy couldn't help but think about how life had its own plans. He had asked for a wife and received an entire family. I had hoped for simplicity and found a complication that could change everything, but maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what his lonely soul needed. The sun continued its descent on the horizon, painting the sky with orange and pink tones. On the porch, the rocking chair Billy had bought, thinking of Sarah, waited in silence. Tomorrow, who knows, it would be Margaret who would sit there, watching her children play in the courtyard. Margaret carried Samuel, who had fallen asleep, on her lap, while Thomas walked alongside, still watching everything, with the intense attention of children who had to grow up too fast. Billy opened the door of the house, and the scent of wood and leather greeted them. It was a simple but solid home, built with his own hands over years of hard work. The back rooms had been empty for a long time. Billy had prepared them with the children he might have with Sarah one day. Now, Thomas and Samuel would occupy those spaces, bringing life to corners of the house that for years had known only silence. Margaret placed Samuel on one of the beds, covering him with the blanket she had brought from Boston. The boy mumbled something in his sleep, and she stroked his hair with the infinite tenderness of a mother who had been father and mother at the same time for months. Billy watched the scene from the door. There was something profoundly right about it, as if his house was finally fulfilling the purpose for which it was built. The walls that had known only the loneliness of a man would now harbor the laughter of a child and the care of a woman. Life, Billy had learned, rarely gave second chances, but sometimes, when we least expected it, it offered us something even better, a first chance to be who we really should have been from the beginning. Dawn in the West doesn't ask if you're ready for a new day. He simply arrives, bringing with him all the promises and challenges that fate has prepared. Billy woke up before the sun, as he always did. His feet touched the cold wooden floor, and for a moment he forgot that he was no longer alone. It was when he heard the soft sound of movement in the kitchen that the reality of the night before came back in full force. Margaret was awake, probably trying not to make noise so as not to wake anyone. He dressed quietly and walked down the creaking stairs. Margaret was standing by the stove, still wearing the same blue dress from the trip, trying to decipher how the equipment worked. His movements were careful, almost reverent, like someone who didn't want to assume too much about his new situation. Billy approached and showed how to light the stove, how to regulate the temperature, where the pots and supplies were. Margaret watched everything with absolute attention, memorizing every detail. It was the behavior of a woman who had learned to adapt quickly or perish. The coffee was made in comfortable silence. Margaret also prepared oatmeal, thinking of the boys who were still sleeping. Billy noticed how she constantly checked the direction of the room where Thomas and Samuel rested, that constant vigilance of mothers who carry the world on their shoulders. When the sun finally broke through the horizon, Billy indicated that it was time to show Margaret the property. They walked out the back door, and she got her first look at the extent of the Thompson farm. It was not the largest estate in the county, but it was prosperous and well cared for. The stable housed 6 horses. There was a corral for the cattle, chickens that scratched freely across the courtyard, and fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Margaret observed everything with practical eyes. Billy realized that she was calculating, assessing how much work would be required, where she and the boys could fit into that established routine. It was the look of someone who had managed a house before, of someone who understood the value of hard work. The boys appeared at the back door, Thomas carrying Samuel by the hand. They both still had that sleepy childhood look, but Billy noticed how Thomas kept alert, responsible. The boy had taken on the role of protector of his younger brother, a burden too heavy for such young shoulders. Billy went to the stable and brought a tame mare named Dolly. The boy's eyes lit up immediately. Thomas approached cautiously, but Samuel ran towards the animal with the blind confidence of childhood. Margaret tensed, ready to intervene, but Billy made a reassuring gesture. Dolly was the kindest of all her horses, accustomed to visitors and children. Samuel reached out his little hand and touched the mare's velvety snout. The laughter that escaped the boy was the first truly happy sound Billy had heard since the family had arrived. Thomas remained more reserved, but Billy saw the desire in his eyes. The boy wanted to trust. He wanted to allow himself that simple joy, but something held him back. It was the premature prudence of someone who had lost a lot and learned that happiness could be snatched away without warning. Billy spent the morning showing the boys how to take care of the animals. He taught them how to give hay to the horses, to collect the eggs from the hens, to check that the animals had enough water. Thomas absorbed every piece of information seriously, while Samuel turned every task into a joke. Margaret did not sit idle. He explored the house, identified what needed to be cleaned, organized, repaired. Billy watched her discreetly and realized that she wasn't just occupying her time. She was claiming that space, making it her own through work and care. Late in the morning, when the sun was already high and relentless, Billy noticed how efficiently Margaret moved around the kitchen, preparing lunch with the ingredients she could find. She had located everything without having to ask, demonstrating that practical intuition that separated women who knew how to survive from those who just existed. During the meal, Billy observed the dynamics of the small family. Margaret cut Samuel's food automatically, while she quietly talked to Thomas about the morning's chores. It was an established routine, polished by time and circumstances. They functioned as a unit, each caring for the other in subtle but constant ways. After lunch, while the boys dozed in the shade of the porch, Billy and Margaret sat on the steps. The midday heat made any heavy work impractical, creating a natural break from the pace of the farm. Margaret looked up at the horizon, and Billy realized that she was seeing beyond his land. She was imagining a future, weighing possibilities, calculating whether this place could truly become a home for her and her children. Billy understood that the next few days would be crucial. Margaret was testing not only whether they could adapt to life on the farm, but whether Billy would be the kind of man she could trust with the most precious possession she owned, her children. The wind blew softly, bringing the aroma of dry land and grass. Somewhere far away, a horse neighed. It was the symphony of the West, music that Billy knew by heart, but that now took on new meanings in the presence of that unexpected family. Thomas awoke from his nap and approached Billy, holding out a small, smooth stone he had found in the courtyard. His eyes asked if it had any value, if it was something special. Billy examined the stone seriously, spinning it in the light, and then handed it back to the boy with a nod of approval. It was a small gesture, but Margaret noticed it. She saw how Billy treated his son's curiosity with respect, how he didn't diminish or ignore the small discoveries that were so important to a child. Something softened on his face, a tension that Billy hadn't even realized existed. The day wore on, and with it the feeling that maybe, just maybe, that unlikely arrangement could work. It would not be easy, and it certainly would not be what any of them had planned. But there was something right about the way they occupied that space together, as if the farm was finally complete. There are times in a man's life when he realizes that he is no longer the same person he was a week ago. Billy woke up on the third day to the sound of laughter coming from the courtyard. It was too early for such joy, he thought, but when he looked out the window, he saw Samuel chasing a hen, while Thomas tried to explain to his brother that this was not the right way to collect the eggs. Margaret watched from the balcony, with that expression that mixed amusement and maternal concern. The routine of the farm had been transformed in a subtle but profound way. The boys woke up to the sun and ran to help Billy with the animals. Thomas had taken on the responsibility of feeding the horses, a task he performed with impressive seriousness for his age. Samuel preferred chickens, fascinated by the eggs that magically appeared in the nests each morning. Margaret had become the silent soul of the house. Billy would arrive for meals and find the table set, the food ready, the clean clothes hanging on the clothesline. She worked with a quiet efficiency, never asking for anything, never complaining about the conditions or the amount of work. But Billy noticed other things too. How Margaret saved on her own meals to ensure that the boys ate well. How she mended her own worn-out clothes while sewing new pieces for Thomas and Samuel from fabrics she found in the house. How his eyes still carried that constant vigilance, as if he hoped that the fragile happiness they were building could disappear at any moment. On the fourth morning, Billy made a decision. He saddled 2 horses and directed Margaret to accompany him to the city. It was market day and he needed supplies. She hesitated, looking at the boys. But Billy had already arranged for them to stay with Ben, the older cowboy who helped on the farm. The ride into the city was initially silent. Margaret rode competently, but Billy could see her tension. It wasn't because of the horse. It was because he was moving away from his children, even for a few hours. It was the anxiety of a mother who had lost so much and now feared losing what was left. When they arrived in town, Billy noticed how Margaret was subtly retracting. The women of the city watched her with barely concealed curiosity, whispering among themselves. It was a small community where news spread like fire in dry grass. Everyone knew that Billy Thompson had commissioned a bride from Boston, and now they speculated about who this woman and the 2 children who had turned up on his farm were. Billy did his shopping with Margaret next door, including fabrics for new clothes for her and the boys, simple toys that he saw Thomas and Samuel observe in the window of the general store. Margaret protested quietly, but Billy was firm. If they were going to be a family, they would be a complete family with all that it meant. At the grocery store, Mrs. Watson, owner of the establishment, could not contain her curiosity. He asked indirect questions about Margaret, about the boys, about Billy's plans. Margaret replied politely, but Billy noticed how she cringed at every question, as if every word was a judgment on her situation. It was then that something happened that changed everything. A man entered the store, Harold Grimm, owner of the local bank and one of the most influential people in the city. Billy knew him by sight, knew of his reputation as a tough man in business and even tougher in personal judgments. Grimm looked at Margaret with an expression of evident disapproval. The words that came out of Grimm's mouth were calculatedly cruel. He commented on women taking advantage of lonely farmers, on illegitimate children being passed off as respectable orphans, on how some men were too foolish to realize when they were being deceived. Billy felt something dark and dangerous move in his chest. He saw how Margaret turned pale, how her hands trembled slightly, how she prepared herself for the public humiliation she had faced many times since she became a widow. But this time, she wasn't alone. Billy stood between Grimm and Margaret, and when he spoke, his voice carried all the authority of a man who had built his life with his own hands and owed no one any answers. He made it clear that Margaret Mitchell was a respectable woman under his protection, that his children were welcome on his estate, and that anyone who questioned this would have to answer directly to him. The silence in the store was absolute. Grimm backed down, unaccustomed to being publicly confronted. The other people present looked away, suddenly interested in their own purchases. The message had been conveyed with crystal clarity. On the way back, Margaret rode in silence. Billy could feel something shifting between them, a barrier being torn down. She had seen that he was willing to defend her publicly, to take responsibility for his reputation along with hers. When they arrived at the farm, they found the boys helping Ben fix a fence. Thomas had learned to use hammer and nails, while Samuel passed the tools with absolute seriousness. They both ran to meet their mother, but Billy noticed how they also addressed him, as if they already considered him part of their lives. That night, after dinner, Billy sat on the porch as he always did, but this time Margaret joined him, bringing a cup of coffee for each. They watched the stars in comfortable silence, 2 people who were learning that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose to build, not the ones we were born into. The boys slept peacefully in their rooms, and the house breathed with the rhythm of an established family. Billy realized that he no longer thought about Sarah, about the plans he had made for a different life. This life, complex, unexpected, full of challenges, was the life he had chosen, and for the first time in years, he felt truly complete. Margaret bowed her head slightly towards him, a small but meaningful gesture. It was his way of thanking him, not only for his defense in the city, but for having opened his home and his heart to a family of strangers who had nowhere to go. Billy nodded in response. Words were unnecessary among people who had found, in the vast American West, something more precious than gold or land. They had found belonging. Winter arrived earlier that year, bringing with it storms that tested not only the Earth's resilience, but the strength of the bonds that bind people together when all else fails. Billy woke up one morning in December to the wind howling around the house like a wild animal. The first blizzard of the season had started overnight, and he knew it would be one of the worst he'd ever faced. He went downstairs and found Margaret already awake, watching through the window the white curtain that engulfed the outside world. In the months that had passed since that first day, the Thompson farm had completely transformed. Thomas now rode alone, helping Billy gather the cattle and check the pastures. Samuel had grown in both stature and confidence to become the official keeper of the chickens, and proud of every egg he collected. Margaret had not only taken over the care of the house, but had also become the person Billy consulted on important farm decisions. But this storm would be unlike anything they had faced together. The snow fell for 3 days without stopping. Billy and the boys struggled to keep the animals sheltered and fed, while Margaret kept the fire burning and prepared hot meals that warmed them up when they returned from chores in the biting cold. It was a constant battle against elements that seemed determined to break anyone who dared to challenge them. On the third night, when the wind finally died down, Billy found that they had lost some cattle. Worse still, Dolly, the boys' favorite mare, had disappeared. Thomas was devastated, and Billy saw in the boy's eyes the same panic he had when he lost his father, the fear that everything good in his life might just disappear. Billy spent the whole next morning searching for the mare. Following tracks partially erased by the snow, he found her trapped in a ravine, wounded but alive. The rescue was dangerous and time-consuming, but when it finally brought Dolly back to the stable, the joy on Thomas and Samuel's faces was worth every moment of risk. It was that night, while tending to Dolly's wound together, that Billy realized how they had become a true family. Not just people living under the same roof, but people who cared deeply about each other, who shared fears and joys, who faced hardships together. Margaret watched from the stable door, and Billy intercepted her gaze. There was something different in his eyes that night, a peace that wasn't there when he arrived. She had found not only a home, but a place where she truly belonged. The days passed, and spring arrived with its promise of renewal. Billy decided it was time to make it official, not out of obligation or convenience, but because he had discovered that he loved not only Margaret, but the entire family they had built together. One afternoon in March, as the first wildflowers were beginning to appear, Billy found Margaret in the garden she had planted behind the house. She was kneeling among the flower beds, her hands dirty with dirt, her face touched by the spring sun. That was how he would always remember her. Not as the desperate woman who had arrived from Boston, but as the woman who had made his home home. Billy reached over and reached out to help her up. When she accepted, he didn't let go. Instead, he held his hands between his, dirt and all, and talked about what he was feeling. It wasn't a lot of words. Billy was never a man of long speeches, but they were the right words. Margaret smiled, and it was the first real smile Billy saw on her face. Not a smile of courtesy or gratitude, but a smile of genuine happiness. She had found something she thought she had lost forever when her first husband died. She had found love again. The preparations for the wedding were simple. The ceremony took place in the town's small church, with Ben as a witness and the boys next to them. Thomas carried the rings with solemn earnestness, while Samuel scattered flowers he had gathered in Margaret's garden. Harold Grimm and a few other townspeople attended, not out of support, but out of curiosity. Billy didn't care. I had learned that people's opinions matter much less than the peace that is found in making the right choices for the right reasons. After the ceremony, when they returned to the farm, Billy realized that nothing had changed and everything had changed. The house was the same, the tasks were the same, but now they were officially a family. Margaret was his wife. Thomas and Samuel were his stepchildren, and he was the man who had found his true calling not only as a farmer, but as a husband and father. That night, sitting on the porch under a starry sky, Billy reflected on how life had its own plans. He had asked for a wife by mail and received an entire family. I had expected simplicity and found complexity. He had sought company and discovered love. Margaret was at his side, watching Thomas teach Samuel how to identify the constellations. The boys had grown so much since that first day, not just in size but in confidence and joy. They had learned that it was possible to trust again, that not all adults disappear, that homes can be rebuilt even after they are destroyed. Billy pulled Margaret closer, and she snuggled against his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. They had built something solid together, something that could weather the storms that life was sure to bring. The wind blew gently across the grounds of the Thompson farm, carrying the aroma of fertile land and promises of future harvests. Somewhere on the horizon, a coyote called to the moon and was answered by another. It was the music of the West, the symphony of a place where brave enough people could write their own destinies. Billy Thompson had ordered a bride, but he received much more than that. I had been given a family, a renewed purpose, and the understanding that sometimes life's best blessings come disguised as unexpected complications. The farm prospered in the years that followed. Thomas became a skilled cowboy, Samuel developed a knack for horses, and Margaret turned that rough Texas land into a home where love grew as abundantly as corn in the fields. And Billy learned that a truly rich man is not one who has more land or more livestock, but one who has a family that loves him and a home he can always return to. He had found his fortune not in gold or earth, but in the smiling faces that greeted him at the end of the day, in the small arms that wrapped around his neck, in the soft goodnight kiss of a woman who had chosen to love him. The West had taught him to be strong, but Margaret and her children taught him to be whole. If you like this Wild West story, don't miss the next adventures. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting storytelling of cowboys, ranchers, and families who have met their fate in the wildlands of Texas.